Radio. This is Indigenous Vanguard. I am your host, Citlalli Citlalmina Anahuac.
To begin our very first episode of Indigenous Vanguard, I first and foremost want to acknowledge the land on which we stand tonight, which is from our brothers and sisters from the Tongva territory. I want to thank you, brothers and sisters, for hosting us all of these centuries, for sharing land and space, resources, and for being welcoming as we do our journeys through what we call Semanawak and others call Abyayala. Thank you very much, brothers and sisters, for honoring us with your presence. Also acknowledging our ancestors, the struggles that have come before us. We want to make sure that we know we're not just simply individuals, but we are a continuation of struggle, of love, of fierce activism, and fluid politics that got us to where we are. So we are not here alone. We stand on the shoulders of our ancestors. So to begin, basically this first show is going to be about what is Indigenous Vanguard? What are we going to focus on? Well, first of all, Indigenous Vanguard is a radio program created to highlight the ideas, the movements, and projects that prioritize the Indigenous experience of the original people of the Western Hemisphere. We will present some of the newest and groundbreaking research, activism, and creativity being produced by Indigenous folks. We want to take the vanguard lead that approaches the needs and expressions of Indigenous people in an unapologetic way. We do not subscribe to colonial labels and identities created by colonial governments like United States of America, Mexico, Canada, and all the other colonial nations that seek to erase our Indigenous identities, histories, and heritage. We are here to create space that is inclusive of all the expressions of our people, including the respectable gender identity, class, and relationships to their own indigeneity. We hope that our program empowers Indigenous listeners to heal, create, and actualize their goals. My name is Citlalli Citlalmina Anahuac. You may be wondering, who the heck is this woman on this show? Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I am a poet, activist, historian, and producer. I am interested in creating narratives and taking ownership of our experiences. As far as academia goes, I have a bachelor's and master's in history. I focused my research on Indigenous history of Mexico and Central America. I have been an activist for 22 years, and that experience has allowed me to develop a deep sense of history and the importance of knowing who we are. I created my YouTube channel back in 2008, and since then, I have been using different avenues of social media to create content that expresses the ideas of decolonization, re-education of my people. I am a self-published poet, and my book, Obsidian Blades, is being used at different community colleges throughout California, as well as Cal State LA. Recently, I have recommitted myself to creating more visual content and documentary-style films, which allows me to take people into the experience and journeys of being Indigenous. I am entering a new journey of moving away from creating a counter-narrative, but I rather want to focus on creating our own narrative. Now, whether our narratives that we are creating, if they counter anyone or anything, that's besides my point at this point in my life. My priority now is to create, research, and share what I'm coming across. So to begin, we have to decipher what is Indigenous Vanguard, or what the hell is Indigenous? We hear it all the time, right? We hear Native, Indigenous, Indian. Well, let's see what the fabulous Merriam-Webster has to say about Indigenous. According to Merriam-Webster's definition, it has to do with having originated and being produced, growing, living, or occurring naturally in a particular region or environment. Now, that's the Webster definition. The definition that I put together according to different studies is basically a general concept attributed to different populations of original people known to inhabit, create, and live on certain areas. The term has become more popular in the last 20 years as many original people are relearning their indigenous identities and histories. It serves as a concept and idea that challenges the Eurocentric terms that do not properly acknowledge the power that indigenous people have and their connection to the land. Colonial identities that connect us to Europe, for example, Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, raza and mestizo, truly do rob us of the opportunity of reclaiming who we are. And Vanguard simply means front line, right? I want to present and share with y'all the most recent research activism philosophies that are being produced and created right now by indigenous people. The main peoples that I'm going to focus on are basically from the Western Hemisphere. We're talking about Canada, the US, Mexico, Central America, so-called South America. At the end of the day, all of us are really indigenous people, and I'm going to get into the construction of the binary of what is and what is not indigenous towards the end of the program. So let's talk about identity. Indigenous, it is an identity. It is a concept. It is an idea, philosophy. But why does an identity matter? Why is it important? Well, I argue that identity is power. And so if you don't know your identity, if you don't have an identity, you're really lacking a foundation, a source of possible power. And if someone is giving you an identity and is labeling you an identity, then that's also a source of being taken the power away from you. It's a theft of power. So let's talk about this in more detail so you can know what I'm talking about. Let's take the term Hispanic. Hispanic means a person or culture belonging to Spain. There is a big population in the millions in the United States of America, which is known as a colonial country, that are known as Hispanic. Under that category, Hispanic people are Mexican, Salvadorian, Puerto Rican, and the other groups that fall under the category of Central and South American. Now, the people that are being identified as Hispanic are being identified by a term that was created by the U.S. government in the late 70s to try to categorize a group of buying power that they could not really put their finger on. The term Latino also came into the mix as well. So basically, this is a marketing scheme. It's a marketing scheme created to lure the idea that everyone who speaks Spanish or has a Spanish surname belongs to one group. It completely irons out any differences, unique qualities, or cultural experiences and histories belonging to that group. Do I agree? Do I think this is a positive contribution to identity? Absolutely not. I think the terms Hispanic or Latino, and even the most recent one, Latinx, do a disservice to honoring who we are as indigenous people. I am speaking to you in the English language. I've had conversations all day in the English language. I've talked to people who are white, black, and Asian today in the English language. Now, does that mean that all of us are Britannic because we all spoke in the English language and we text each other and probably emailed in the English language? It doesn't work that way. The capital of culture and identity used to highlight a false notion that people that speak a common language somehow are ethnically and racially connected is a fraud. So that's what I mean about identity. Mexicans, Central Americans, by and large, the majority of us are indigenous people. But if you're looking at the power scheme of white supremacy and the institution of power as a racial system of hierarchies that are meant to keep people in place, if you have an indigenous people that have survived a genocide of 95% of their population, and you're creating these new countries, and they are surviving and they are living in those countries, then what happens to their identity? Well, erase them. That has been the agenda of colonial governments. They say they're not Indians anymore. They're not, indigenous people anymore. They're all Hispanic now. They're all Latino now. And I'm talking about the very specific Mexican Central American experience, right? Because, for example, let's go to Mexico. People say, well, if you don't like it here, you're obviously proud Mexican, go back to Mexico. Well, the problem with that is, well, Mexico is not governed by Mexicans. The problem is that the colonial presence of power in the so-called Americas is fully intact. Yes, Mexico did gain its independence. However, it wasn't Mexicans who kept the power after they were actually free from the Spanish crown. It's really important to understand that, much like the United States when they were up against the British. They fought independence, right? The Tea Parties, the Tea Revolution, the American Revolution, it's all to disassociate themselves from Britain, right? They wanted to separate themselves. They didn't like the taxation. They didn't like the monarchical powers that were existing. Well, much like Mexico, the Spaniards who originally invaded Mexico were tired of having to pay tribute to the Spanish crown. And therefore, they said we must now become a new country, a new identity. And so they disassociated themselves from Spain by becoming Mexico. When this happened, Mexico did not become Mexican, and the indigenous people were not in power. It was a colonial presence that continued to dominate and control Mexico. To this very day, we may be surprised to know that the politicians, the cabinet, the presidents of Mexico have not been Mexican. They've been European, they've been Irish, they've been a bunch of other European groups, but Mexican. For example, Vicente Fox. He came to Los Angeles one day and he spoke about the Mexican money that was going to Mexico and the buying power of Mexicans in Los Angeles. And as he looked into the crowd of Mexicans, he said, oh, I can relate to them, mis paisanos, right? My compatriots. I relate to Mexicans. Again, this is the Mexican president of Mexico at the time. He said, I can relate to Mexicans because like me, I've also left my heritage and my ancestors. And Vicente Fox was not talking about Mexica or Aztec or Mayan ancestors. He was talking about the Irish and his own lineage of Europeans. So I thought that was very interesting. He's very bold and open about who he is, but under this guise of Mexican independence and nationalism, we think there is a distinction when there's not. It's the same buying power. And so I use that as an example because in Mexico today, the way that they look at an indigenous population is much like the U.S. looks at an indigenous population. In Mexico, when they're taking the census or their version of the census, if you are 100% full-blood indigenous, but you speak Spanish, according to the Mexican government, you are no longer indigenous. They will mark you down as mestizo. In Mexico, if you are 100% full-blood indigenous and you have migrated to the city and you are now working in a corporation or company, you are now considered a mestizo. You are no longer a full-blood indigenous person. And so what does that do? What ideas, what perceptions, what are they trying to lure? And the possible is that they're trying to minimize the indigenous population. They're trying to say, there's not that many of them anymore. We are now in the wider world. And we have to remember that that connection of white supremacy and the winding up of these identities all was a complete approach to politics and national identities in the early 19th and late 19th century, where there was a movement to completely erase indigenous people from these newly occupied and created colonial countries. I talk about all that because it is important to understand that power lies in identity. And when we are in dealing with a population, for example, Mexicans, Central Americans, who do not have a clear sense of who they are, coming over to the United States, and the United States government categorizes our population as Hispanic or Latino, it completely wipes away any possibility of us reclaiming our true identity. For example, in the year 2000, the LA Times published an article about how Mexicans chose to identify in the U.S. Census. And let me share with you that 40% of Mexicans identified as white. This also included, from that time, the mayor Antonio Villaraigosa. He's a Mexican governor that was mayor at the time. And this troubled me, as I did not think that this was still an issue. However, the article did go on to say that a lot of Mexicans simply sought identity as status, as capital, as power. And so that showed me that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in our communities for us to understand how identity works. And so the problem with Hispanic or Latino, again, they do not reflect the indigenous experience. At the end of the day, all of these terms, Hispanic, Latino, raza, mestizo, even the term American, Native American, are problematic to me because they do not honor and they do not empower indigenous people. Part of the show is to challenge and to, like I said, not give a counter narrative, but to create a narrative. Indigenous Vanguard. What we're doing here is creating a new way to view ourselves, a new way to view the world. And many people are doing this. This is not new. For many decades now, it's been documented that historians, sociologists, philosophers, theorists are actually debating these ideas. For example, I'm going to introduce you to a very powerful thinker. His name is Aníbal Quijano. Aníbal Quijano passed away about 2-3 years ago, but was a powerful voice and critic of Eurocentrism and colonization. He was a Peruvian sociologist and philosopher who is credited with constructing the term coloniality. So basically, he represents an actual academic who is in academia in Peru, who is challenging the way we view the world in systems of power. It is important to understand how systems of knowledge are placed in a hierarchy that rationalizes the way humans have been divided by a worldview that supports the fraudulent concept of race and the institutions of white supremacy. And it's important because he criticized the concept of history. And let me tell you, I'm a history major. I had to listen to his criticism. He says history is seen as a constant battle between the European plan to conquer all continents and the submissive indigenous person. Quijano defines coloniality as, quote, a new world order, a global power that was created by a violent process under the control and for the benefit of a small European minority, end quote. Under coloniality, social orders emerged from the colonial era and are found in all aspects of power. The colonial structures are reinforced by the categorical systems of discrimination that are reinforced by racial, political, and social hierarchical orders. For example, the European narrative of indigenous encounters have long dominated our understanding of what the quote-unquote conquest meant to indigenous people. right? We have a triumphalist view of conquest. Anything we have to know about the indigenous experience and the so-called Spanish conquistadors, it always starts with language. The conquest of New Spain, the conquest of Mexico, the Spanish conquest. So even in the way we are describing a world impacting, event as that, it already sets the tone to who was the winner and who was the loser, who was the one that had the power and who was the powerless. And it's important to understand that. We take language for granted. And yes, we are using a colonial language. English, obviously, even if it's Spanish, are colonial languages. But the way concepts are used to normalize the colonial experience of indigenous people is something that should be further studied and investigated. And I'm not just talking about academia. I'm talking about our everyday lives. And one thing I want to share in the concept of indigenous, because it's important to understand this, since that's the title of the show, I was listening to an interview with Aníbal Quijano. And in that interview, he said that in 1492, Europeans indigenized the world. And at first, I was very bothered by this because I said, wow, why are we giving so much credit to Europeans? How does that mean that I'm calling myself indigenous as a result of that? Am I honoring that invasion? And so this huge binary unsettled my view of indigeneity, right? The mass disruption of human populations and mass genocide has really crippled many people's understanding of self. So the concept of indigenous really is a new start. It's a way to begin your journey. It's a foundation that allows you to reclaim who you are, because a lot of us, we don't know. We are detribalized indigenous people. A lot of us lost connection to who our original nations were. But at the end of that interview, I understood what he meant, at least to the interpretation that I walked away with, is that basically the process of European colonization of the world disrupted and capitalized the human experience in ways that assaulted people's life and their worldview as they lived in their land. And that disruption of conquest, genocide, and the birth of capitalism really did shatter the view of who was indigenous and who was not. So to take this further, for example, when we look at indigenous people, we only think of brown people, right? Sometimes we'll think of African people. But the concept of indigenous, everyone is indigenous one way or the other, right? But the concept of indigenizing the world is something that is really important because we have this idea, this fraudulent concept of white supremacy and power that indigenous people did not go out and explore the world, or that other people on this planet did not go out and explore the world. And as a historian and as someone that has studied this, I have studied how the Chinese went out into the world. Our own people navigated, example, for all of the Americas, our people, there's trading routes that have been found all the way from South America, Peru area, all the way to the Four Corners area in the Southwest. So this concept of exploration, this concept of us being stagnant and not communicating with the outside world, it's really a racist concept that robs other people from the actual credit that they did explore the world. But what is different here is when the Chinese explored, when the Mexica or other indigenous groups explored, it wasn't with the intent of genocide and mass conquest. And that is a challenge to say, because a lot of people try to normalize the experience of colonization as to say it's a human experience. And I understand as humans, we are experiencing that. But I'm not going to stand by and say that it's true and that it's a normal fact. It is not. That is something that we have to understand as Indigenous people. And so the idea of conquest, colonization, and genocide was normalized through the process of colonization, which is important to understand as we're looking into this system of power. And in this show, in Indigenous Vanguard, you're going to meet a lot of people, activists, poets, writers, teachers who are looking at the world and are really trying to bring in an Indigenous concept and perspective into their daily life. And it's important to do so. Again, as we're starting to create a narrative and we're going to record our own voices and our own experiences, it is important that we honor that. It is important that we challenge these narratives, that we challenge the normalcy of racism and the normalcy to think that everyone was just bound to be conquered. That is something that is very common in, I would say, the Mexican culture, where especially when we're talking about Catholicism and Christianity, we have a very racist view of Indigenous worldviews. You know, anywhere from Disneyland to the exotifying of Pocahontas and the Indigenous perspective of land, Mother Earth, and our four elements, to Hollywood movies that mock the Indigenous experience and worldview. It is patronized. It is seen like as a childish view of the world. And the actual depth of Indigenous philosophy, theory, theology, and worldview is really minimized by the mainstream. And I think it's important to have shows that really highlight and complicate and challenge our Eurocentric view of Indigenous religion and Indigenous perspectives. So to take it back to indigenizing the airwaves and Indigenous Vanguard, I want to make sure that you understand that what we're talking about here, and many people think, oh, this is a crazy idea. What are you talking about, colonization? And it's a really human need. And part of the way that I am approaching this show is approaching it as medicine. We have to see that the decolonization struggle is a healing aspect of our health, talking about mental health to our physical health, to the way that we view ourselves. Everyone should have the right to honor who they are and know who they are. It's important to understand knowledge as healing, especially as Indigenous people. So with that, we're going to end the first portion of the show. And later, we're going to get into other ideas and how other people of the world have dealt with the issue of conquest and colonization.